Hello and welcome back. It's October again, so you know what that means. It's spooky season. Time for ghosts, goblins, and monsters. What I'm looking at today is a set of monster toys that I had no idea even existed until the creation of the internet. That's because these monsters were never sold where I grew up in the US. This set of figures is called Super Monstruos. They were created by a company called Yolanda in Spain, first appearing in the 1980s, and then coming back in the early 1990s. This particular set I have is from 1992. Super Monstruos are a series of 24 PVC figures modeled after classic monster and horror archetypes. As you can see, I have a set of monochrome figures with a mix of the four colors that are available: gold, silver, green, and purple. But Yolanda also released a fully painted version of this set. The fully painted figures are a bit more expensive to acquire than the monochrome figures. At the time of this recording, on eBay, it would cost a little over $200 to get a complete set of the fully painted figures shipped from Spain to the US. After first discovering these figures online, I assumed they would be around 2 inches tall, which is the size of standard Army Men style figures here in the US. But when I received them, I was surprised to find that they are much larger than that, closer to a 3 3/4 inch 1/18 scale figure. Here you can see two of these Super Monstruos figures, next to some of these Super 7 Universal Monsters reaction figures. So these Super Monstruos are large enough to make a nice display, and would be easy to paint if you're so inclined. Since these figures are made of PVC, they are quite flexible, so some of them do have a tendency to warp, and they have trouble standing up once you get them. But I think if you applied a little heat and reposition the limbs, you would be able to get most of them to stand on their own. Each set of figures comes with this fold-out pamphlet that features illustrations of all 24 figures and a little bio for each character, of course written in Spanish. The pamphlet itself is an accordion-style fold-out, with 12 figures pictured on each side. Let's go through and meet each of the 24 members of the Super Monstruos team. Please bear in mind that I am far from fluent in Spanish, so my descriptions of the figures taken from the pamphlet will be paraphrased from whatever Google Translate tells me that it says. We begin with the Pirata, a classic swashbuckling pirate. Not necessarily a monster, but certainly a classic villain. And you can always consider him to be a ghost pirate to put into that monster category. His bio reads, evil beings with a good list of crimes of which they are satisfied. They kill for pleasure and take possession of the treasures of their victims. Next up we have Diablo, the classic devil. In the fully painted version of this figure, he is appropriately colored bright red. His bio reads, angel evil owner of the underworld. His power is superhuman and destroys the conscience. Dominator of evil, when choosing a victim, you are not immune. Next up is Cyclope, the Cyclops. And already we can see the wide variety of types of characters in this set. We've had two classic archetypes in the pirate and the devil, and now we have a monster from Greek mythology. His bio reads, Ulysses, legendary character, faced this gigantic one-eyed being. It fed on human flesh. Good to know. Vampiresa, the classic female vampire. When you think of a female vampire or a bride of Dracula, this is usually how she appears, with the long dark hair and the long flowing gown. And this look has been parodied many times in characters like Morticia Addams, Lily Munster, and Elvira. A loose translation of her bio, with a fierce vampire angelic appearance, she uses her feminine charms to subjugate men. Here's a monster from classic literature, Dr. Jekyll, who of course transforms into the monstrous Mr. Hyde. This figure is sculpted as having him in mid-transformation, so it gives him an appearance much like Two-Face from Batman, where one side of his head is sculpted to be Jekyll and the other side is Hyde. Serious and hardworking scientist who, in a desire to help mankind, produces a complete metamorphosis, becoming brutal and merciless. Our second literary monster, also the star of a famous and long-running musical. Let's see if I can say this without butchering it. El Asesino de la Opera, the Phantom of the Opera. Great musician who was disfigured in a fire. He now takes refuge in the sewers of Paris, awaiting the performances. Our next monster comes from history. Jack el Destripador, Jack the Ripper. English murderer whose identity has not yet been discovered. Butchered his victims, leaving no evidence. Supposedly, he was a doctor. And you can see they've sculpted him in what has become the iconic look for this character, with the overcoat, top hat, and doctor's bag. Here's one of the more unusual inclusions in the set, not based on anything from literature or any classic monster archetype. This is Caballero Errante, the Wandering Knight, old soldier killed in battle, whose ghost cannot find forgiveness, roams through time struggling with himself. The Wandering Knight being a classic-looking skeleton warrior in knight's armor, like something you'd see out of a Ray Harryhausen movie. This one's pretty straightforward. Esqueleto, the skeleton. Set of bones that hold incredibly. If it appears, you can be impressed. He likes to frighten. I guess we can all be impressed then. This is probably the one figure in the bunch that I don't think has a chance of standing up on his own. His pose and those spindly legs just won't allow it. Here's our first monster from film, Hombre Mosca, the Flyman. Although this is not a licensed figure, this is obviously modeled after the classic 1958 film The Fly, which starred David Hedison and Vincent Price. It's not an exact copy of that character from the film, but that's certainly what they're referencing up to and including the bio, which reads, during an experiment involving molecular transmigration, a researcher accidentally becomes half insect, half man. Here's another unusual inclusion, another character from a movie that has not been licensed. This is Simio, which is clearly meant to be one of the ape soldiers from Planet of the Apes. His entry reads, in the future, men will be slaves of these monkeys with intelligence. And this is one of my favorite figures from this set. We go from two movie monsters that were unlicensed to one that is actually licensed. This is obviously Freddy Krueger. And there's a blurb on the pamphlet that reads copyright 1984, 1982, New Line Cinema. So Yolanda decided to knock off The Fly and Planet of the Apes, but it looks like they actually went out and got the license for Freddy Krueger. His bio loosely reads, a ghost come back to life, his hatred of the human race, and especially his old acquaintances, takes bloody revenge on his sharpened hands. And this is actually a pretty nice little version of Freddy, accurate right down to his striped sweater. Alright, we've reached the other side of the pamphlet, and we're gonna get into some heavy hitters now. Starting with Dracula, Emperor of Vampires. Sleeps dormant in a coffin during the day, and attacks his victims in the evening, who are converted into slaves. Yep, well, that's pretty much Dracula. In the fully painted version of this figure, he does have a little blood trickling out of his mouth, as one does when they are king of the vampires. Next up, it's the heaviest of the heavy hitters, the Grim Reaper, La Muerte, Death. Can't really get more monstrous than that. His bio reads, people waiting for their moment with impatience. Spares neither, respects nothing. Takes life mercilessly. Sounds about right. Here we have a little cryptid representation with the Yeti, aka the Abominable Snowman. Human-like and hairy, it is said to appear when you least expect it, in the high peaks of the Himalayas. Elusive and mysterious, its existence has not yet been determined, but I like to think he's up there somewhere. This next type of monster has become more well known as a comic book archetype. It's El Monstruo del Pantano, monster of the swamp, sort of like a swamp thing. And looking at this figure, the sculptor definitely took inspiration from the artwork of Bernie Wrightson, the comic book artist that co-created Swamp Thing. Here is Imhotep, a classic Egyptian mummy. Imhotep was an actual historical figure. He was a real pharaoh in ancient Egypt. His name was used to identify the mummy in both of the mummy franchises, the the classic Universal monster film from 1932, as well as the 1999 reboot, which was more of an action-adventure film that starred Brendan Fraser. Imhotep's bio reads, Egyptian priest who comes to life after a spell, ruthless character who seeks immortality. We've seen Dracula and the Mummy, so it was just a matter of time before we got to the big guy. Here's Frankenstein, one of the most famous monsters in the world, thanks to his many appearances throughout literature, film, and comic books. Giant monster created from human remains. Its creator cannot avoid the horror that has run loose. It wouldn't be a collection of monsters without La Bruja, a classic witch. There are good witches and bad. Power and art can trigger real spells of destruction and calamity that only they can master. This witch seems to be modeled after the classic depiction of the old crone, sort of a Baba Yaga type witch, rather than the broomstick and pointy hat witches that we most often see around Halloween. Let's get some more undead representation in this group with the classic zombie, complete with his drooping flesh, dead eyes, and tattered clothes. By voodoo and magic, you can be converted into living dead. And then the translation reads, who dispossessed own brain and butchers will be terrible. I guess you can get the idea from that. He's gonna eat you. Another so-called monster, culled from classic literature? It's Jorobado, the Hunchback. Good old Quasimodo. Deformed and mysterious, everyone laughs at his ugliness. However, he has a good heart and is able to give his life for his beloved. We're in the home stretch now with another classic icon. Hombre Lobo, the Wolfman. Man suffering the full moon metamorphosis, becoming a formidable and merciless butcher. They often do not remember their misdeeds. This character can certainly be a monster in certain contexts. This is Verdugo, the Executioner. He's got the classic look of a medieval executioner, shirtless, black hood covering his face, giant axe, and a severed head in his hand. Delightful. At all times there have been these characters, masterfully using his weapons, leaving lifeless and legal those condemned to fall into their hands. Lifeless, yes, and okay, I guess it's legal. And last but not least, we have the all-time easiest Halloween costume to make. Phantasma, a classic sheeted ghost. People died and were condemned to live eternally and repent their mistakes. They wish to rest in peace that they cannot obtain as they torment the living. That's it for my look at the Yolanda Super Monstruos figure set. It's a fun little set of figures, and if you're a fan of monster toys, I would definitely recommend tracking down a set. As always, thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you in the next video.